So we're going to start the second part of this blockchain. Xavier Lavayssières. Xavier is an entrepreneur, lawyer, developer. He has founded les Bricodeurs, designers and artists, which aim is to disseminate digital culture. And now he will speak about smart contracts and of a new legal order. It's to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. You hear me well? Good. Thank you for being here. So I've been asked to be really pedagogic in my presence. So we try to maybe put together a few pieces we have seen this afternoon about blockchain technologies. First, a few words about myself. So I've worked first part of my career in public business law, so more on the side of institutions. And I've also studied and worked in a few projects on the side of computer science. And that's why I'm working in two organizations. One is from the side of more institution and doing education toward lawyers and managers on what is the digital culture, so more corporate training. And on the other side, it's more grassroots non-profits of people who are more like, so Bricodeurs, it's kind of a word made up to mean like hackers or makers. And the idea is the gap on the other side from people who know a bit of technology and want to share it with a broader audience, specifically kids and adults. So let's talk a bit about the future and the 18th century in France. In the 18th century in France, you had an aristocracy holding most of the power and having their strengths in knowing the law and the institutions. On the other side, they were the judges, they were the lawyers, they were the priests, they could control all the society. On the other side, you had the bourgeoisie. They were emerging two main reasons. One, they were getting money from the businesses they had flourishing all over. And on the other side, they were also exchanging ideas, the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, and developing a scientific and technology culture that empowered them. You know what happened next. That was the revolution. We sometimes summarize it as the people taking the power. I more think that it's that took over the aristocracy. So nowadays, we have a similar setup. We have still a class that holds the power, knowing the law and the institutions. And on the other side, we have an emerging culture of people who are getting the money and exchanging their ideas and technologies. And this is a relation. And this matters because this cultural setup, Bitcoin appeared. As it was mentioned before, it wasn't the first attacking a cryptocurrency. There were prior ideas and projects. But this emerged at a particular time in history, where after the financial crisis, there was a need for alternatives to the current financial system, and so maybe helped in this emergence. So now, how a blockchain works. If you had to remember three things from this afternoon, that could be those three words: a transaction, a network, and mining. The transaction is a payment you do in current life works the same way. You have somebody sends money to somebody else, a particular amount, and signs it. Any payment you do is exactly the same way. When you write a check, you write the name on the person you send it to, you put the amount, and you sign it. When you do a credit card payment, it's exactly the same. You give your card, and you type your code, and it's sent to the work. So any transaction is the same. The transactions in them are no different. You have somebody who sends money to somebody else. Only different, though, you don't have a unique account number. You have references to prior transaction. Something you have to understand is that no Bitcoin, the whole point and how the blockchain works is that no Bitcoin is created out of nothing. So each time you make a payment, it's because priorly you had the control of that money, so somebody gave it to you. And so each time you make a transaction, reference from where you got the money and at which transaction you give the money, to who you send it to, and you sign it, exactly the same way you do a paycheck. Second, the network. The network, again, is nothing of rocket science. It's just a peer-to-peer network of computers that are connected together, exactly the same as Napsters, 𝕒𝕠𝕘𝕚, BitTorrent nowadays. It's just a software computer that connects you to other softwares on other computers and allows the exchange of information. So your transaction that you signed is sent through that network and shared among all who are connected to that network. So far, nothing really new. The only a bigger part is the mining part. So how in a peer-to-peer network we validate transaction? How we make sure that a payment was real, was accurate, that you had the money, that the source was correct? On the Visa network, it's pretty simple. You have the Visa company that checks your accounts and make sure that they're right. Or your bank, or you have a central authority. The idea in the blockchain is that we're going to avoid that because having a central is a weak point for several reasons, for governance, for technical reasons. And so we have to distribute the power of validating among the network. One way to do it, randomly choose somebody. The problem is, in computer science, having some number is extremely hard to do. So the solution that was up instead is to give an excessively hard problem that takes about 10 minutes to solve, and that it requires somebody who wants to create the last transaction in the network to commit a lot of energy on that. They need to put money to acquire the machines and a lot of electricity to check, to be able to validate the block. That makes a strong incentive to not go wide, because you have spent so much energy on doing that you don't want now that the Bitcoin loses value. So that it is. Each block is once somebody has solved the problem, they validate the transaction, and they emit it again to the rest of the network. And each block is added to the rest of the network. And that's the full registry. One point you have to understand on the Bitcoin and how that works well is the governance part. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but just bear in mind that it doesn't work so much of the technology, but because there is a subtle equilibrium between the interests of the miners that have a lot of money and energy in being able to validate the blocks, the users that want able to make payments, and the developers that are developing the code. None control totally the network. Each of them has an influence on the network, and that's what makes the value of it work. There has been an idea of going a step further and using that network to not only do payments and money, but doing something more. So first, we have to go back on what is a computer to understand how that works. A computer, you probably have been told that is a writing machine, something that is really strong at making math. To me, it's wrong, actually. A computer is the contrary of a smart machine. It's on the idea of Turing was to, on the contrary, make something really dumb, really simple, like a really dumb drunk worker could do, and that would allow him to solve any problem, not only just a mathematical problem, but any action in the world. He could do it by breaking down to really small steps. So that's the idea. And that's what we call the Turing machine. You have heard this word priorly in the afternoon. So a Turing machine is just a machine that can execute any operation, breaking down in really small steps. And so on that idea, the Ethereum project in 2013, so as you noticed, like 5 years after the release of Bitcoin at the start, was to build on top of the same blockchain, but use the network and the transaction not only to do payment, but to execute code on the network, making it a Turing machine that has any operation, but as it breaking down to really simple operation, it can be transformed in stuff that shared by simple transaction. To give you an idea, an overview of what we can do with smart contracts, this is a few projects. We have done a kind of event race a few months ago where we had various people coming from all over France, and we them understand the technology and try with them every kind of they could have. What was interesting is to see what are the opportunities we can with that, which are quite close to actual startups that are getting built at the moment. For instance, the first one was the idea of using the contract to register each time you have a bottle of wine from a seller. And so you can check each steps, the wine step, to avoid any counterfeiting. So that's it. Other project, one is about decentralized energy, how you could exchange with your neighbors over the energy you have from your solar panels, and without having to go through a central authority, and so on. A few interesting parts using connected device and making them directly themselves connect and interact. I'm going to go back on that later. Another thing about smart contracts that might not be that on the network, that's kind of where the information is exchanged and you are sure that everything happens the way you want it to. But on the front side, you can have really different interfaces. So it's not necessarily something extremely geek that needs to be only handled by people with long beards. On the left side, you have the bird way to do it. You have on the middle like clients that are a bit more easy to use. But you can imagine also having a real interface using text messages to interact with that smart contract. How that compares to law? That's a question I get often asked. So to understand that, you have to understand that a contract in law is not the piece of paper you sign. The paper you sign is just a proof for the contract. The contract is the fact with somebody else of agreeing of mutual obligation and meaning that is mandatory for both of you to respect that obligation. So the paper doesn't matter in an actual contract. The same with a contract. The contract is not by itself the contract, but if you intend to sign a service, the fact that you wanted to do that, that is the contract that links you with this in front of you. The difficulty you have is a regular contract, you can read it in English, kind of. Again, you need somebody likely who knows laws and institutions to be able to decipher precisely what it means, because you might not know what are the implications of a particular sentence. On the smart, it's a bit different. To understand it, you need to understand code. And that brings and was a different kind of people who are going to be able to really understand how that works. And when you have a conflict of interpretation in a contract, and that happens all the time, because while law exists, if we were just agreeing, we wouldn't need laws. And when you have a conflict, you have really different setup. In a regular contract, you would go to a trial and spend money, and that definitely gives more abilities to people who already know the system, have more money, and so on. On the other side, on the smart contracts, normally it would be exactly the way it was intended to be executed. So in an ideal world, that would mean that that will make sure that stuff happens you both wanted at first. But it can go wrong, and it has been proven a few months ago. The 𝕤𝕗, for those of you who don't know, was an investment fund. So people were putting money in the fund with the hope of having after maybe return on the money, and also there was a democratic vision where you could vote on where the money would go. So you were agreeing on the contract. But the contract was poorly written. Somebody could took 50 million out of the 150 million that were in the contract. You definitely have a new kind of problems. The point I raise is where we, in the society where we're going to have more connected device, we're going to have more artificial intelligences and more service. And as perfectly explained Yves Moreau before, like interfaces and all those connections are going to be the services we're going to interact directly and are going to enforce on us a part of their functioning. So in that setup, those contracts are going to make even stronger automation and the regulation process. In that, we really need in advance to be all aware on how that works, be able to read a bit of code, or at least understand well enough to be able to decipher that. As you have civic lecture when you are in school, you should have also a lecture to be able to understand those codes. But that point I wanted to raise. Thank you, and if you have any questions.